holy. Holy is a big and important concept in Scripture. Our last song was just about God and his holiness. We believe in the holiness of God. We believe that we are called to live holy lives, to be a holy people. In Hebrew, this word is kadesh. And kadesh simply means apartness or sacredness. Typically, when we define it for other people, we say holy is to be set apart. But what does it mean to be set apart? What are we set apart from, or what are we set apart for? The Israelites, as we know, were called to be a people set apart from other nations and cultures around them. The Israelites were called to follow God alone, not other gods, not other deities, not other supernatural beings, not other rulers. The Israelites were given the 10 Commandments as 10 ways that God commanded or instructed them to live differently than those around them. And we, the church, we Christians, are called to be holy. Both in our individual lives and our corporate lives as the church, our together lives as the people of God. Not just on Sunday mornings, but whenever we are the church. The call God gave to Moses on Sinai in Exodus 19:6, which is right before the giving of the 10 Commandments, is this: "You will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." And it's echoed in 1 Peter 2:9. You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. Peter also says in 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 15 and 16, "But just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do. For it is written, 'Be holy because I am holy.'" And this is an echo of Leviticus 11, 44 and 45, and Leviticus 19:2. But what does all of this have to do with holy ground? Well, twice in Scripture, we have the phrase, "Take off your sandals. For the place you are standing is holy ground." And the first time we see this is in Exodus 3:5. If you have your Bibles, you're welcome to join me in Exodus chapter 3. Exodus 3 is the story of Moses and the burning bush. Most of us probably know this story pretty well, whether it was from being a kid in Sunday school class, maybe we watched the 1998 film, The Prince of Egypt, right? This is the story where Moses, who remember, Moses is Hebrew, right? He's part of the family of God, but he is raised by Pharaoh's daughter as an Egyptian. So he is ethnically Hebrew, but culturally Egyptian. And he's raised by Pharaoh's daughter, and at this point in the story, in Exodus 3, he's living in exile in the land of Midian. If you remember, he had to flee Egypt in chapter 2 because Moses went to help a fellow Hebrew who was being hurt by a fellow Egyptian, right? Moses is in this dichotomy of these two worlds, and in the process, Moses kills the Egyptian. And this angers Pharaoh to the point of attempting to kill Moses. So Moses flees and ends up in the land of Midian. And so while in Midian, he meets a man named Jethro, who is a priest of Midian. And Jethro likes Moses, thinks he's pretty cool, and says, "Hey, marry my daughter Zipporah." And so now he's there living life. And it's been a long time. It's been a long time between leaving Egypt and living in Midian when this account happens in Exodus 3. So I'm going to start in the story in Exodus 3, verse 1. "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, 'I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up.' When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, 'Moses, Moses.' Moses said, 'Here I am.' 'Do not come any closer,' God said. 'Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground.' Then he said, 'I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. So, as far as we know up until this point in this story of Moses' life, Moses has not encountered God. He's not encountered the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Being raised by Egyptians, he would be familiar with the gods of Egypt. And having married the daughter of a Midian priest, he'd be familiar with Midian deities. So Abraham and Isaac and Jacob might be kind of foreign to him. And in this story, God introduces himself. Right? If we kept reading a little bit farther, this is where he says, Yahweh, I am who I am. And God says to Moses, I'm going to have you bring my people out of Egypt. If we think about it, if Moses had never encountered God prior to this event, coming face to face with God's holiness in a bush that doesn't burn up is a pretty big and monumental way of first encountering God. So the second time we have this phrase is in Joshua chapter 5. So if you want to jump over to Joshua 5 with me, this is right before the Israelites conquered Jericho. And if you remember, this is the story of Jericho. This is one you might also remember from Sunday school class. This is the story where for 6 days, the Israelite army walks around Jericho once per day. And then on the 7th day, they march around it 7 times. Right? I remember being a kid in Sunday school class, and we'd get those big cardboard blocks that are red and blue, and you'd stack them high, and you'd walk around it 13 times, and at the end you'd all shout and hit it down, right? So that's this story. So we're going to pick up in Joshua 5, starting in verse 13. Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or our enemies?" "Neither," he replied, "but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" The commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. So at this part of the story, Joshua has already been installed or appointed as leader of Israel. He's already kind of taken over from Moses. If we remember at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, God is preparing the Israelites to cross the Jordan River to go into Canaan, the promised land. Moses is still the leader of the people. He's somewhere around 120 years old at this point. And if we remember, after the burning bush, Moses agrees to go back to Egypt. He connects with his brother Aaron, and they connect with his sister Miriam, and they lead the people out of Egypt together. Right? In chapters 7 through 11 of Exodus, we have the 10 plagues. Things like the plague of darkness, the plague of the blood in the Nile River, the death of the firstborn. And then in chapters 12 through 14, we have the actual Passover and the Exodus out of Egypt. Right? We have Israel cross the Red Sea, and if you remember, Egypt comes and follows them, and as the last person gets through, right, at least according to the Prince of Egypt movie, that's when all of a sudden the waters crash down on Egypt's army. The Israelites see God perform miracle after miracle. They see God destroy the Egyptian army. They see God provide time and time again. But like a lot of us do, they don't see those things. All the people really see is that the food they brought with them out of Egypt is running away, is running dry. They're tired, thirsty, they're hungry, their clothes are starting to wear out from journey. And as naturally they start to complain. And then in complaining, God again provides. He performs miracle after miracle. Then God brings Moses to the Mount Sinai in preparation to give him the law. Before giving him the law and the 10 Commandments, God says to Moses, "Give this message to the people." And this is what it is. "If you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation." And of course the people, they all respond together, "We will do everything the Lord has said." But they don't. After this, right, Moses goes up, he's on Mount Sinai, he's having this amazing encounter with God. He is face to face with God, and the people start complaining. They're like, "I don't know where he is. It's been a long time. why don't we make our own God? A God we can see. And this is that whole golden calf thing, right? They take all the gold that they got from Egypt, because they kind of plundered their neighbors, and they create a golden calf and they begin worshiping it. God obviously is furious, and he sends Moses down the mountain to deal with it. And God's like, I'm going to wipe them out. I'm going to get rid of them because they just said they'd keep my covenant and they're not. And Moses pleads for them and says, please don't do this. These are your people. So God chooses to forgive them again. And God continues to walk with them. So then we a little bit later, and Moses takes this census and tries to figure out how many people are in each of the 12 tribes. And then he sends 12 men, one from each of the 12 tribes, into the land of Canaan, the promised land, to scout it out, to kind of figure out what's going on. And they're there for a while, finding what food there is, looking at the different people groups. And they come back out, and 10 of them are terrified. They're like, nope, no way, we can't do this. We can't conquer these people, they're too big. But 2 of the men, Joshua and Caleb, say, let's do it. God's got our back. We'll do this. The people of God grumble against Moses and Aaron, saying, if we had only died in Egypt or in this wilderness, why is the Lord sending us into this land only to let us fall by the sword? And this is the point where the people of Israel are essentially punished. This is the point where they begin their 40 years of wandering. Instead of them being wiped out, God decides to allow this generation of adults, the ones grumbling, the ones too scared to follow him into Canaan. He says, you know what? You're just going to live your lives. You're just going to get old and die naturally. And then your children will be the ones that go to Canaan. But not only are the people of Israel forbidden from entering the promised land, Moses is too. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, beginning in verse 49, God says this to Moses. Go up into the Arabim range to Mount Nebo in Moab, across from Jericho, to view the land of Canaan. The land I am giving the Israelites as their own possession. There on the mountain that you have climbed, you will die, and be gathered to your people, just as your brother Aaron died at Mount Hor and was gathered to his people. This is because both of you broke faith with me in the presence of the Israelites at the waters of Meribah Kadesh and the deserts of Zin, and because you did not uphold my holiness among the Israelites. Therefore, you will see the land only from a distance. You will not enter the land I am giving to the people of Israel. So Moses and that whole generation that left Egypt, they die. They don't enter the promised land. The only 2 adults that get to are Caleb and Joshua, because they're the 2 scouts that said, we can do this. They had faith. So this brings us back to Joshua 5, verses 13 and 15, where Joshua has his own experience of standing on holy ground before the Lord. In some ways, these two instances, Moses at the burning bush, Joshua before the commander of the Lord's army, they're both kind of bookending this whole entire Exodus event, this wandering in the desert, leaving Egypt and preparing for the Holy Land. Moses' first encounter with God is with his shoes off. While Joshua had already been installed or appointed as Israel's new leader, this is the point where Joshua is about to fully lead the people. He's going to lead them into battle by taking down Jericho. And when Moses first encountered God, it was right before he went to confront or battle Pharaoh. So the people have just crossed the Jordan River. They moved from being exiles in Egypt and wanderers in the wilderness to being conquerors and settlers of Canaan. It's almost as if God is telling them, regardless of where they are, whether it be Egypt or Midian, the desert or the promised land, God is there and God is holy. But can places be holy? Are places holy? If we are living post-cross, post-resurrection of Jesus, if we are New Testament people, are places holy? In John chapter 4, we have this great story of Jesus and the woman at the well, is what we call it. This is the story where the disciples and Jesus passed through Samaria to go from Judea to Galilee. Typically, at that time, Jews would completely go around Samaria, adding days to their travel to avoid Samaria. Jesus is like, nope, we're going to go straight through it. And they come to a town called Sychar, which the text says is near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from his journey, sat down by the well. For some reason, at this point in the story, Jesus is alone. We don't know if the disciples went to Sychar to get more supplies or kind of what was going on, but Jesus is sitting at a well by himself. And a Samaritan woman arrives by herself to draw water from this sacred well. And Jesus says, "Will you give me a drink?" The woman points out, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" The text tells us that Jews and Samaritans don't mix, but the John's account doesn't tell us why they don't mix. That's something that we have to understand the Old Testament for, which begins back in 1 Kings. So long story short, right, Samaritans were descendants of the 10 northern tribes. If we remember, right, we have 12 tribes. 12 scouts go to scout out the land. 10 of them say, "No way." 2 say, "Let's do it." Those 2, Caleb and Joshua, right, they're all for God. Later, we find the same thing. We find that out of the 12 tribes, 10 of them want to follow God, or 2 of them want to follow God and 10 don't. So if we remember, we have Saul, and he becomes the first king of Israel. And God's like, "You're not doing what I'm calling you to do, so I'm not getting rid of you," and now David's king. Then David has his son Solomon, and then Solomon has his son Rehoboam. But what happened with Rehoboam was that Rehoboam had gotten really tight with the people. Rehoboam had said, "I'm going to tax you even harder than my father Solomon ever did. I'm going to enslave you even more than my father Solomon ever did." So the 10 northern tribes say, "We've had it." And a man named Jeroboam is raised up and becomes their king. So now we have the northern 10 tribes and the southern 2 tribes. So after a few hundred years of really bad kings and really unfaithful leaders in the northern tribes, they're invaded by the country of Assyria. Eventually, the southern tribes are invaded by Babylon. So the Samaritan woman in the well is a descendant of the northern tribes of Israel. She still is a Hebrew. But what it is that when they were taken over by Assyria took the Israelites in the northern tribes and scattered them. They didn't want them to be a people group anymore. They said, "You need to go and assimilate with all the other people groups. We need to intermarry." So this concept of the Israelites goes away. And that's where the Samaritans come from. They're part Jews and part these other nations. Because of this, the Jews saw them as unclean. They were mixed race. However, many of them, especially the ones that lived in this area of Samaria, still worship God. They still recognize the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as their God. So in Jesus' conversation with the Samaritan woman, they have a conversation about holy ground, where worship can and should truly happen. So beginning in John 4:19, this is what we read. "Sir," the woman said, "I can see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place we must worship is in Jerusalem." "Woman," Jesus replied, "believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father, neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is Spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth." Jesus' words with the Samaritan woman, whom the early church named Fotin, they seem to say there's no such thing as holy ground or holy places. And this has become an issue throughout church history. We know that in the early church, churches met in homes. Eventually, sometimes Christians would start to meet in caves or in graveyards or in catacombs. A big reason for this was the persecution. It was a way to hide. It was a way to be out of the eyes of the Romans who were trying to persecute them. Another reason is that's where their sacred were. That's where their holy dead were. But remember, at this time, a lot of people were being martyred and killed. Right? Dan preached about Stephen recently, who was our first martyr. They were killed for their faith. So they'd go and they'd place them in the catacombs, and often the ones that were martyred were given high places in the catacombs, places of reverence. And they'd go and hold church there. We know in Hebrews that the author of Hebrews talks about the great cloud of witnesses. Perhaps they met in the catacombs because while the dead were there, it was their cloud of witnesses. So as the church came out of hiding and Christianity became the official religion of Rome, of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, church buildings began to be built. They began to be built and to look like Roman imperial buildings, or to look like the buildings of the pagan gods. We need to remember that when Jesus died and the curtain was torn in two from top to bottom, God left the box that he was put in the temple. But as Christianity became more popular and was led more by the empire, church buildings began to look more and more grand. The taller and more ornate, the better. We put God back in a box. Every few centuries, groups rise up. They take God out of that box, and they remember we don't worship in physical locations, and they pushed for the worship in spirit and in truth. But as movements go, these ebb and flow, and we end up back in boxes. God ends up back in a box. The reality of the matter is, though, is that we are physical beings. When God became incarnate, when Jesus was born and he took on the flesh of humans, right? Jesus reminded us that physical is good. Our physical bodies, with their ailments and aches and pains, with their various heights and sizes, God said, physical is good, body is good. And by becoming physical, God reminded us that our physical bodies live in a physical world. And by having the physical be good, it also means the physical is holy. So do we stand on holy ground? Can places be holy? Yes and no. Last fall, Dan preached a sermon on a man named Naaman, who was not an Israelite, but he had leprosy. And so he goes to Elisha the prophet to ask for him to be healed. And Elisha says, go to the Jordan River and dip in it 7 times, and your leprosy will be healed. Naaman's really angry about this because he sees the Jordan River as dirty, unclean, and unholy. His 2 rivers in Damascus, the Abana and Pharpar, are far superior, far holier than the Jordan River. Eventually he does it. He washes, he's clean as white as snow. But that isn't the end of the story. Naaman returns to Elisha and says, and asks for as much earth as a pair of mules can carry to bring back to his home in Damascus. His plan is that when he makes sacrifices, he would do it on the dirt he brought with him, so that he's standing on Hebrew dirt, essentially, on the dirt of God. That way he could connect his sacrifice to the God of Israel instead of the gods of Aaron. For Naaman, the physical dirt or the physical land of Israel helped him focus on the true God. He was able to worship in spirit and in truth because he focused on truth. The spot of land in Aaron where he put the dirt from Israel became holy ground for him. Psalm 24, 1-2 says, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the whole world and all who live in it. For he founded it on the seas and established it on the waters. Genesis 1 teaches us that as God makes the whole world, right? And in verse 31, God says that everything he made was very good. In Hebrew, it's tov me'od. All the world, every square inch of it, from the depths of the seas to the highest mountains, God created a good world. And if it's a good world, it's also a holy world. But here's the thing, it depends on what we do with it that makes that physical place holy in the time and space. Are you guys familiar with the Rajneeshis? You might have seen a documentary on Netflix called Wild Wild Country from a few years ago. The Rajneeshis are a group from India who followed a man in the 70s and 80s called Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. And in 1981, Bhagwan and many of his followers moved to rural Oregon outside of a town called Antelope. From 1981 to 1985, thousands of people lived and visited this area, this religious community called Rajneeshpuram. Unlike some cults and religious communities, the Rajneeshis weren't necessarily evil or bad themselves. The Rajneeshis believed in spiritual liberation. They practiced living freely with others. For the most part, their theology, their philosophy was harmonious. But what happened was that the Oregonians of Antelope began to be overrun by the outsiders. Thousands of visitors, of all the thousands of visitors who came each year. And long story short, the Rajneeshis decided they were going to take over Antelope, and eventually their plan was to take over Oregon. So the way that they were going to take over Antelope was there was a local restaurant that had a salad bar. And the night before a big town election, they poisoned the salad bar, and a huge percentage of the voting population of Antelope got sick, couldn't vote. There's some other criminal activity by a few people within the leadership of the Rajneesh community. It fell apart, and the land was sold at auction. For nearly 10 years, this land sat vacant, although a developer did try multiple times to turn it as profitable. You see, many Oregonians wanted nothing to do with this land because of the unholiness of the Rajneeshis, because of the way they treated and hurt the people in Antelope and the rest of Oregon. But here's the thing about land. Land is not holy or unholy. Land, the earth, the ground itself is God's. It can be holy if we stand on it for God, and it can be unholy if we stand on it for ourselves and the purposes of the world. So where is your holy ground? Where is the place, the location, the piece of earth where God says to you, take off your sandals? This ranch where the Rajneeshis once lived is now owned and operated by Young Life of Oregon. Young Life is a parachurch ministry that's across the country. It's a youth ministry program. And this Young Life camp is on a land that no one wanted to touch. It's ground that was deemed as unholy due to the unchristlike activities that went on there. But this land is now deemed as holy. For some people, it is the most sacred place they know, because every year, thousands of teens go and they experience the goodness and the holiness of God. Where do you find holy ground? It can be in a sanctuary like this. Although sanctuaries and church buildings are not in themselves holy. They're holy because of how we use them. When we enter into it on Sunday mornings, when we enter for worship and fellowship, we make it a sanctuary. When God is gathering with his people, it is holy. Sometimes a holy place, though, doesn't exist anymore. Or sometimes it's not accessible to us. A holy place for me is the camp I went to as a middle schooler and high schooler, called Wainema. It's on the Oregon coast. Wainema still exists. My parents are actually there right now. But it's inaccessible to me because I don't live in Oregon anymore. But just as Naaman in the story I referenced was able to bring some dirt with him, we can bring that holy ground from that holy place with us. In Celtic spirituality and Celtic Christianity, they have this idea of thin places. Thin places are locations or moments in which our sense of the sacred is more pronounced, where the space between the transcendent and the commonplace is exceptionally narrow. In other words, thin places are locations or memories of a location or a moment where heaven and earth collide for you, where the physical and spiritual realms are almost one. In February, Asbury University had somewhat of a revival. It had something like 50,000 people visit the college over about 2.5 weeks. And many people, including one of our own bishops, referred to what was happening as a thin place. A place where heaven and earth, the physical and spiritual, were so close together. They were only thinly separated. Even when we cannot physically be in a thin place, we can meditate, visualize on that thin place, that thin moment. And again, we stand on that holy ground and that holy experience. So as I wrap up, here's the two things that I'm challenging you with. One, find your holy ground. Where in your life is holy ground? Where do you, or perhaps should you, take your shoes off when you encounter God? Is there a place that you can encounter God daily or weekly? If that physical place is not available to you, how can you take that place, that moment with you? Is there something physical or visual that can help you step onto that holy ground and into that thin place? Second, come pray with us. On Tuesday mornings, come pray with us. While, again, the sanctuary, the church building is not holy in itself, it can be part of your holy ground. Come join with others in prayer and seeking a holy God, our holy Creator. Enter into holiness together. We realize not everyone has the ability to come on Tuesdays at 7 a.m. We realize that some people work at 7 a.m. on Tuesdays. Some people are caring for their kids at that time. But those of you who can come, come. Come and join us and pray and be on holy ground together. If you can't come talk to us. Let's find another time where you can gather together with your sisters and brothers to enter into holy presence of God. Let us find the thinness of this place. Let us take off our shoes and approach the holiness of a God who loves you and wants to be with you. Let's pray. Good and gracious and holy God, we thank you for the ways that you love us. We thank you for the ways that you interact with each of us individually, the ways that you call us into your holiness, into deeper relationship. I pray today as we go from this place that we will find the holy ground that you call us to spend time in, the places where you are asking us to encounter you deeper. We love you, Lord.